Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us for another week of the Tadaima Fine Art Friday Artist Talk. Wow, we're almost at the end of this series, and it's been such a pleasure to be able to bring to you such talented artists, tonight being no exception. Before we begin, though, I'd like to tell you about a special screening and artist talk that takes place tomorrow at 2 p.m. Pacific Daylight Time. We will be showing the film Moving Walls, The Barracks of America's Concentration Camps by Sharon Yamato, with photography by Stan Honda. Immediately after the screening, we'll be having a live Q&A with Sharon and Stan. Based on the book of the same name, Moving Walls tells what happened to some of the barracks of Heart Mountain after the camps closed. I hope you'll be able to join us for this presentation. This evening, we are joined by two artists, Teresa Tamura and Emma Nishimura. Teresa will present her work, followed by a live Q&A, and then Emma will do the same. So if you have any questions for either Teresa or Emma, please ask them in the comments section. I met Teresa Tamura at the Society for Photographic Education National Conference in Rhode Island. We reconnected at the first couple Minidoka pilgrimages, where she showed her photography project that eventually became her book, Minidoka, an American Concentration Camp, which was published in 2013. Her traditional black and white photographs are at once descriptive as well as meditative. Whether they are photographs of Minidoka or of objects made by the incarcerees, they accentuate the intimate and encourage us to use our imaginations to complete the connection to our own lives. Teresa Tamura is a Sansei, a third-generation Japanese-American born and raised in Idaho. She received an MFA in photography from the University of Washington. She taught photojournalism in the School of Journalism at the University of Montana from 2002 to 2007. She was awarded a fellowship from the Freedom Forum Asia in Honolulu, Hawaii, a National Geographic Faculty Fellowship in Washington, D.C., and a Helene Wurlitzer Foundation Artist in Residence in Taos, New Mexico. She studied as a grad student in art therapy and counseling at Adler University in Chicago. Teresa resides in Walla Walla, Washington. It's my pleasure to introduce to you Teresa Tamura.
Thank you, John, and thanks to all the organizers of Tadaima for your work and vision to make this virtual pilgrimage a reality. I appreciate the opportunity to talk about my photography with the theme of end of war and redress in mind. Many of you are well versed in this history of the incarceration of Japanese and Japanese Americans during World War II, but to my surprise, I still meet people who don't know. You'll see a number of photographs taken at various points of time, some of mine and some by other photographers, to provide background and context to my book. Gratitude goes to Scott Gibson, publisher of Caxton Press in Caldwell, Idaho, operated by the same family for 5 generations and focuses on Idaho history, and to all the people who helped and supported me. There's a 14-minute video on YouTube made by Art Wright, my photography professor from Idaho State University. Art attended the 2013 Minidoka pilgrimage with me. If you haven't watched it, please do. On YouTube, search Minidoka and the number 2. The video can also be seen on the Tadaima website under my name in the Fine Art Gallery. I found this picture amongst my grandparents' photographs. My maternal grandmother, Kuniko, is the one kneeling on the far right side. I don't know who took this picture, but I thought it was a good example of how photography can communicate in a universal language that anyone can understand. A picture is like a time capsule that can release memories associated to a specific time and place. Just like music, that's also a power of photography. My maternal grandparents, Junji and Kuniko Hamada, were like many first-generation immigrants, or Issei, who came to America for a better life with work for the men in the railway system, agriculture, lumber, mining, or for a few to study as university students. With the passage of the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, all Chinese immigration to America came to a halt. Cheap laborers were still needed. My grandfather was 16 when he heeded the recruiter's promise of work on the railroads in 1906. After saving his money for 10 years, he returned to Hiroshima, Japan, and selected my grandmother to be his wife. She was 18 when they married and began farming in Idaho. Essentially, these next two photos depict events that are bookends of this war. December 7, 1941, the naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan conducted a surprise attack on the U.S. naval base in Pearl Harbor. President Franklin D. Roosevelt declared war the next day. World War II ended on September 2, 1945, after 2 atomic bombs had been dropped on Japan, the first over Hiroshima on August 6, 1945, then a second one over Nagasaki on August 9. Some family relatives were among the fatalities. Figures in both cities combined were estimated between 160,000 to 200,000 people died by the end of 1945 from the result of exposure to intense heat, physical force, and ionizing radiation emitted from those bombs. August 10, 1988. President Reagan congratulates Norman Mineta, co-sponsor of the reparations bill, known as the Civil Liberties Act of 1988. A presidential apology and symbolic payment of $20,000 was given to those directly impacted by the loss of liberty or property due to discriminatory action by the federal government during World War II. Now, going back in time, August was also the month when Japanese and Japanese Americans began arriving to Idaho by train in 1942. Francis Stewart, a photographer hired by the U.S. government to document scenes from Minidoka War Relocation Center, photographed the Sakura brothers from left to right, Gerald, 5, David, 6, and Chester, 1.5. The boys had lived in Eatonville, Washington, a small logging community in the foothills of Mount Rainier, quite a different landscape from Minidoka. On the right side, the stretch of railroad tracks is where people disembarked to board the awaiting buses nearly 60 years earlier. Dorothy Hirai and Incarceration who remained in the area to this day. I don't know exactly where we were, but I remember Dorothy saying, "Turn here, turn here." She had an incredible memory, and I was fortunate to have her as a guide. The dark line denotes the military exclusion zone. Every ethnic Japanese on the left side of the line from Washington, Oregon, California, Alaska, even some from Arizona, 120,000 people, 2/3 American citizens, were incarcerated by U.S. military decree. According to 1940 census figures, there were nearly 127,000 Japanese and Japanese Americans. That means approximately 7,000 others lived on the right side of the line. My grandparents and parents, who were high school graduates from the class of 41, were among that group. Signs were posted about a month after President Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066 on February 19, 1942. Based on the approximate date when this photo was taken, Japanese on Bainbridge Island had about a week to prepare to leave their homes, taking only what they could carry. This picture is from the Library of Congress collection, courtesy of Densho. In this Associated Press photograph, we see a young Frank Kitamoto in the arms of Corporal George Bushy as his mother and sisters gathered to leave Bainbridge Island on March 30, 1942. As was the situation for many families, Frank's mother, Shigeho Kitamoto, had to prepare the family for the forced departure without her husband while caring for their 4 young children. Frank's father was among the men who were immediately arrested after Pearl Harbor was bombed and taken away to Missoula, Montana, one of the alien detention centers. As I worked on the book, occasional exhibits of my photographs allowed me to see people's reactions. The strongest ones came from the pairings such as this one. Another scene from March 30, 1942 shows 227 Bainbridge Islanders being forced to leave their homes. This photo is part of the Seattle Post-Intelligencer collection at the Museum of History and Industry. On the right, the late Frank Kitamoto as an adult in 2002. He stands next to an inscribed rock that still remains in place at the Bainbridge Island Japanese American Exclusion Memorial. This site was designated as an official National Park Service satellite unit of the Minidoka National Historic Site in 2008. A commemorative outdoor exhibit was fully completed and opened to the public in July 2011. The photo on the left, the late Fumi Hayashida and her daughter Natalie, was also taken on March 30th as they left Bainbridge Island, an iconic reminder of the forced evacuation. On the right, Fumi and Natalie at a Minidoka reunion held in Seattle more than 60 years later. The historic image was not published in the Seattle Post-Intelligencer in 1942. When Fumi died in 2014, Natalie told a reporter for the LA Times, "She was nobody, and yet she was everybody." I feel unique as a third-generation Idahoan of Japanese ethnicity. There's not many of us, and I'm not alone when I say I never learned about this mass incarceration in any classroom. I was taken aback to discover this photo while searching through the Idaho State Archives online collection. I was looking for pictures of Nampa's historic, but no longer standing, Dewey Palace Hotel, the background structure on the right. This Ku Klux Klan parade took place in Nampa in 1924, the year after my grandparents moved from eastern Idaho to Caldwell, where my parents were born and raised. Nampa, my hometown, is right next to Caldwell. My family lived a few hours away from the historic Minidoka site. This man, the late Robert C. Sims, gave me directions for how to find Minidoka. I'd never been there before. After a portion of the historic Minidoka site became the 385th unit of the National Park Service, I wanted to know more about what happened there. Dr. Sims introduced me to Minidoka with his presentation, Art in the Camps. He first learned about the mass incarceration from Roger Daniels, after Daniels had just written Concentration Camps USA, Japanese Americans in World War II, and came to speak at the University of Colorado, where Bob, as they came to know him, was working on his PhD in American history. Bob and his wife Betty moved to Idaho in 1970 and made it their home. He taught history at Boise State University and did many things for a greater good. Back when no one talked about what happened, Bob got the conversation started in Idaho, and it continues to this day. He is greatly missed. A new book about Minidoka features a selection of Bob's research, along with essays from other notable people. An Eye for Injustice, Robert C. Sims in Minidoka, edited by Susan M. Stacy, was published in 2020 by Washington State University Press. The cover photo is another image taken in the Minidoka War Relocation Center, and I've often seen in different online archives, as well as reproduced in numerous books. I was able to identify and locate the children in this photo through a series of emails and assistance from a number of different people in Seattle. Eileen Ito, now Eileen Ito Lee, and Kenny, as she referred to him, Ken Yamaguchi, were neighbors in Block 44 at historic Minidoka. Ken's father, Jack Yamaguchi, worked as a business manager in the camp office of the newspaper, the Minidoka Irrigator. When Jack and his mother, Dorothy, were still alive, they would point out to Ken that he was the boy in the picture. Ken was born while they were incarcerated there. Eileen's mother kept a copy of the historic photo in a family album. This is the same little girl, Eileen, with her parents, Kenji and Fumie Ito. A visitor took the photo, which shows Minidoka's bleak surroundings. Kenji was a young attorney with a law degree from the University of Washington. He was arrested after Pearl Harbor and charged with acting as an agent for Japan without registering as such with the State Department. He was acquitted on April Fool's Day, 1942. The trio went from Camp Harmony, the Puyallup Assembly Center south of Seattle, to Tule Lake in Northern California. Eileen's mother had family in Minidoka, so they were able to transfer to Idaho, where this picture was taken. Minidoka's barracks were hastily constructed, as the dates of the two bottom photos would indicate. August 18, 1942, construction was still well underway. Records indicate incarcerees began arriving as early as August 10th. Francis Stewart, a WRA photographer, took both of the construction photos. The top photo of the single barrack was made possible by a group of volunteers who established the Jerome County Idaho Historical Society in 1981. They later opened the Idaho Farm and Ranch Museum in Jerome County, where I took this picture in 2001. The structure had been moved to the I-Farm in 1999, where it still remains. This is the interior of the barrack at the I-Farm. The early Minidoka pilgrimages used to stop at the I-Farm to tour through the barrack before heading on to the historic site. A barrack was divided into 6 apartments, each measuring 20 feet by 20 feet. The room was heated with a coal-burning stove seen in the back right corner. A typical barrack building measured 20 feet by 120 feet. 12 barracks created a block. When Minidoka closed, barracks were given to lottery land winners and also auctioned off and moved off-site. This is Ken Yamaguchi again, the little boy in the earlier photo, with his grandmother and parents. This was a controversial picture according to a confidential War Relocation Authority weekly report from late December 1944. John Graham, report officer from Minidoka, wrote, "I believe we should take every opportunity to create a favorable acceptance of Japanese Americans. I certainly did object to it on the basis that it more closely resembled Margaret Bourke-White's representation of a Georgia sharecropper than a depiction of the neat Japanese American we're trying to foster." From the previous example of a barrack interior of Block 44, here's another version from Block 66, home of Amy Nishi Kawamoto, the little girl in this photo. Amy wrote, "In December 1942, an Army photographer came to our barrack to take photos of our one room. My mother and father had decorated the room by putting up plywood and wallpapering the walls. The United States government wanted to show the country that the internees were living in very nice quarters, as the photos conveyed. These photos were most likely used for propaganda purposes. As the photos show, my parents made the best of a very sad and uncertain situation." This is a rare photograph that shows barbed wire and a guard tower. Photographers were instructed not to include these elements. On the back of this photo, there's a stamp with Johnson & Son, Boise, Idaho. The rest of the Johnson & Son photo collection documents the buildings and infrastructure of the Minidoka site. This is a digital image I made in July 2019, just before a dust storm. A guard tower was recreated by faculty and graduate students from Boise State University's Department of Construction Management with funds from a grant and private donations secured by the Friends of Minidoka, a nonprofit organization dedicated to education, research, and historic preservation of the World War II incarceration experience. A dedication was held during the 2014 Minidoka pilgrimage. The weather conditions at Minidoka were and still are very harsh. I wanted to show the different seasons. This is a gatehouse in January 2004. The irregular black border around my black and white photo show the edge of the negative. It means the full frame was printed using a filed out negative carrier. My point of view comes from years behind the lens as a photographer who works in a documentary style. The Latin root word for documentary is docere, which means to teach. Infrared film was my favorite to use for its high contrast and dreamlike appearance for the outdoor locations. Neil King was the National Park Service superintendent for the Minidoka National Historic Site from its inception until 2008, when he retired after 40 years of public service. Neil was instrumental in bringing the local community who lived near the historic site on board, as well as listening to and respecting the wishes of those who were incarcerated in Minidoka. The first time I visited the historic site in fall 2001, it was hard to imagine that at its peak population, it was Idaho's 7th largest city. The area seemed largely forgotten. The sign installed by the Pocatello Blackfoot Japanese American Citizens League told me where I was. The stone structures were the most visible reminders of what was left of Minidoka. As part of an archaeological excavation in 2002, Phil Gensler left and Jim Burton Wright removed the sign that marked the location for several decades after the historic Minidoka site was closed. Anything that was not an original feature was removed. The aerial view on the left shows the Minidoka War Relocation Center fully completed. On the right is the 2012 aerial view taken at a slightly different angle. The red box outlines the location of Block 22, where an original barrack and mess hall are back on site for visitors to see. This aerial was the last photo I felt I needed to complete the book. Going back in time a bit, August 1979, a 6-acre parcel of the former Minidoka War Relocation Center was dedicated in a public ceremony after being listed in the National Register of Historic Places. 11 years later, in 1990, it was named an Idaho Centennial Site. Then, in 2001, President Bill Clinton signed a proclamation designating 72.75 acres of the original site as Minidoka Internment National Monument. In 2008, the name was changed to Minidoka National Historic Site after representatives of the National Park Service asked members of Congress for a name change. The reception building at the entrance features a fireplace made of basalt boulders quarried from the area by incarcerees. A storage cellar, which fronts Hunt Road, is less than a mile from the site's entrance. This was taken in the early morning. It was originally constructed at Minidoka in 1943, built to store root crops such as potatoes. Built partially underground and insulated with tar paper and hay bales, 30 by 200-foot structure was partially restored in 2003. Quickly, I want to show an example of how cropping a photo can remove important information. The Spanish Club group shot from Minidoka's Hunt High School yearbook, Memoirs 1945. Then, the full frame of the same photograph. I saw the negative in the National Archives and ordered a copy. I thought all those collages told a story. Sometimes I wanted to take pictures of pictures. Here's Robert Hosokawa and his wife Yoshi, who were in Minidoka for less than a year before he was released for a job at a newspaper in Independence, Missouri. Their first child, David, was born in Independence. When I met Mr. Hosokawa, I showed him a photo of the Minidoka Irrigator newspaper staff, wondering if he might be in the picture. He wasn't, but he shared how the name of the camp newspaper came to be. Minidoka, from a farming standpoint, was in the middle of irrigation country, he told me. That's why it was there. Canals ran around the camp, and because of these canals and irrigation, this countryside is able to have crops. People get livelihoods from it. In the same way, this newspaper would irrigate the minds of the people. This front page of the Minidoka Irrigator is from March 14, 1943. Chet Sakura, foreground center, is the father of the 3 young boys framed by the train window seen earlier. With the formation of the Japanese-American combat team announced a month earlier, the headline tells us 300 volunteers answered the call to duty from Minidoka, the highest number of volunteers of any of the 10 war relocation centers. The young Sakura brothers were depicted again in this 3-generation family group shot. 7-year-old David is standing front and center. John Bigelow, a reports officer at Minidoka War Relocation Center, took this photo, most likely for publicity purposes. Dan Sakura is the son of the now adult David Sakura, who was a little 7-year-old boy in the previous photo. Chet Sakura, who is in the other photos, one of the military volunteers from Minidoka, is Dan's grandfather. Dan traveled to Idaho from Washington, D.C. in January 2001 as White House Senior Policy Advisor for the Council on Environmental Quality. Dan recounted the trip was to conduct outreach to the local community as part of our effort to develop a recommendation to President Clinton to use his authority under the Antiquities Act to establish a national monument. Now, due to his help, this period in American history will never be forgotten. The honor roll sign was prominently displayed at the entrance of the Minidoka War Relocation Center. The top photo was taken sometime after February 1, 1943, when Japanese-American men were permitted to serve as soldiers. The names of Dan Sakura's grandfather and great-uncles would have been listed here. By the time the Minidoka War Relocation Center closed in 1945, more names were included with the addition of 2 more panels as shown below. A replica was made and placed in the exact same location in July 2011. The bottom photo that I took also includes Emily Momohara with her arm around the late May Nampa, taken in July 2013. Behind the honor roll sign was a Japanese-style garden created by Minidoka incarceree Fujitaro Kubota, a Seattle landscape designer. Kubota's 20-acre property and business used to be located in the Rainier Beach area of Seattle, which is now a City of Seattle park named Kubota Garden. Photography means writing with light. The literal translation for the Japanese word for photograph, shashin, means copy of the truth. Anna Tamura on the right and Emily Momohara left are 2 Yonsei who had family members incarcerated in Minidoka. To me, they represent the youth and energy that drives continued preservation and educational efforts about this history. Anna, through her work with the National Park Service and research about the gardens in the war relocation centers. That's how I knew who designed the garden at the entrance. And Emily, through her fine art, initiation of restarting the Minidoka pilgrimages, and work as a founding board member of the Friends of Minidoka, the nonprofit organization. Don't miss Anna's garden presentation from week 6 or Emily's artist talk next Friday on August 14th. Gardens beautified the surroundings of historic Minidoka, and Yasusuke Kogita made an amazing one outside of his barrack in Block 5, as evidenced by this photo. He's standing on the far left. He explored the surrounding area for special rocks and plants, and with the help of his 2 young sons and a cart he made, was able to bring back some surprisingly large and heavy ones. When Minidoka was closed, Kogita had the stone shipped back to Seattle. This is the son of Yasusuke Kogita, Paul, who was a 12-year-old when he was in Minidoka. Now he and his wife, Taka, have his father's garden rocks on Beacon Hill in Seattle. This large chimney rock from the desert area around Minidoka is now in front of their home. Paul still remembers venturing out into the desert with his older brother Ted and his dad to search for these special items. Yasusuke Kogita was in his mid-50s when he made this table from greasewood found near Minidoka. The longer pieces incorporated into the surface design are believed to be made of sagebrush. The table now belongs to Paul Kogita and remains unfinished. Historic Minidoka was surrounded by sagebrush, bitterbrush, and greasewood, so there are numerous examples of creative pieces. Mounted bitterbrush 1942 was collected in the Idaho desert and mounted on an unfinished handcrafted cedar base. This piece was part of an exhibition at the Sun Valley Center for the Arts in Ketchum, Idaho in 2004, honoring the work and legacy of the late George Nakashima, the internationally renowned furniture designer and architect. George kept this piece, as well as several others that he found in Idaho, in his studio. On the right, I met Mira Nakashima when she spoke about her father, George Nakashima, during the exhibition about him in Ketchum. She sat in the mirror chair, an original design created by her father. She was only 6 weeks old when she and her family were sent to Minidoka. The photo on the right was taken by Gretchen Van Tassel, hired by the government to document how former incarcerees were resettling in their new locations. For the Nakashima family, their new home was in New Hope, Pennsylvania, where they have remained. The George Nakashima Woodworker Complex is now a National Historic Landmark. I began the Minidoka project by photographing Roger Shimamura when an American diary was exhibited at the Boise Art Museum in April 2001. I learned about Roger's work through Bob Sims' lecture. Roger and his family lived in Block 6. He's the boy standing in the front row far left with the striped t-shirt and overalls. His grandmother's in the back row wearing a white bandana. In this series of paintings, Roger based each theme on an excerpt from his grandmother's diary. She wrote about the period after Pearl Harbor was bombed, through their transition to Camp Harmony, where Roger turned 3, then on to Idaho. Now 81, a distinguished professor of art emeritus at the University of Kansas, Roger just completed 100 small paintings for a new exhibition. His paintings, prints, and theater pieces address socio-political issues of ethnicity, and he continues to inspire me. Another inspiration is Mitsuye Yamada, pictured here with her brothers, Joe and the late William Tosh Yasutake. 3 generations of her family traveled from Washington, California, Maryland, and Japan to participate in the pilgrimage to Minidoka in 2004. Mitsuye wrote an essay for my book and allowed me to include a poem. She turned 97 last month. Her latest book of new and selected poetry, Full Circle, was recently released by University of California, Santa Barbara. This photo became part of an educational video about the Minidoka War Relocation Center, created and used by the Wassmuth Center for Human Rights in Boise, Idaho, to teach others about our history. In closing, I'll end with a quote from Barack Obama. America is a land where the question of our place in history is not answered for us, it's answered by us. Thank you.
I knew little about our next artist, Emma Nishimura, prior to starting my search for contemporary artists of the Japanese diaspora. Several people suggested I look up her website and was very excited about approaching her for taking part in Tadaima. What fascinated me about her work was the use of integration and dichotomy of the micro and the macro. When viewing her artwork from a distance, it's easy to see the quality of the aesthetics and construction. There's a hook to her work that makes it very easy to digest, but it also encourages people to get in close to see the details of her work. It is then that we are confronted with the layers of narrative composed of her personal stories interwoven with the viewer's own narrative. Based in Toronto, Canada, Emma Nishimura works with the diversity of media, including printmaking, photography, sculpture, and installation. Her work addresses ideas of memory and loss that are rooted within family stories and inherited narratives. She has exhibited nationally and internationally at venues including the Royal Ontario Museum, Toronto, the Royal Academy of Arts, London, the International Print Center, New York, the California Institute of Integral Studies, San Francisco, and the Tai Miao Art Gallery in Beijing, China. Emma's work is in a number of public and private collections, such as the Japanese Canadian National Museum and the Foreign Affairs and International Trade Canada. She has received grants from the Ontario Arts Council and awards from Open Studio, the International Print Center, Art and Print, the Print Center, and the 2018 Queen Sonia Print Award. Emma received her BA from the University of Guelph and her MFA from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. She is an assistant professor and the chair of photography, printmaking, and publications at Ontario College of Art and Design University. So to the community of Tadaima, it's my honor to present to you Emma Nishimura.
Thank you, John, and to everyone involved in organizing this virtual pilgrimage. It's an honor to present my work to this community. For the past decade, I've been researching and creating work that explores the stories and experiences of Japanese Canadians throughout the Japanese Canadian internment. I know many of you here will be familiar with the history surrounding the Japanese American internment, but I'll take a few moments to highlight what happened in Canada. In response to the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in December of 1941, on December 8, 1941, Japanese Canadians were categorized as enemy aliens under the War Measures Act, which began to remove their personal rights. Over the next 2 months, 1,200 Japanese Canadian-owned boats were impounded as a defense measure. My great-grandfather's fishing boat was seized during this time. On February 24th, 1942, the Canadian government issued an executive order authorizing the removal of all persons of Japanese racial origin within a 100-mile radius of the British Columbia coast. During this period, all Japanese Canadians' possessions were destroyed or sold by the government, and the proceeds of those sales were helped to fund the internment. In April of 1942, approximately 22,000 Japanese Canadians were sent to internment camps in British Columbia, sugar beet farms in Manitoba and Alberta, self-supporting camps, road camps, or prisoner of war camps. In 1945, when the war ended, Japanese Canadians were given two options. They could either move east or they could go to Japan. They weren't actually allowed to return to the coast until 1949. But during the internment, so women, children, and older men were sent to live in internment camps. Able-bodied men were sent to work on road camps throughout the interior British Columbia. My grandmother and her family were sent to Slocan City within the interior British Columbia, while my grandfather worked on a road camp, building part of the Trans-Canada Highway. When I was growing up, we heard some of these stories. I can remember sitting at the dining room table at my grandparents', and kind of small snippets would emerge, and I knew the basic, the basic story of their lives. But so many stories were missing. The photograph that you're looking at right now, the image on the right, you can see my grandmother interned in the camp. And the image on the left is my grandfather, I believe, at one of the road camps. And so growing up with these stories, I always wanted to know more. And I was so aware of the silence. And the silence is in between all of those stories. And so for the last decade, I've really been trying to learn my family's history, trying to uncover different stories. But over that time, the work has also broadened to talk about the larger Japanese-Canadian experience and the reverberations that the internment continues to have today. In this image, you're seeing an array of these beautiful landscape images. I took a trip out west in about 2011 and went with my mother and my sister, and it was a pilgrimage of sorts to visit the internment campsites. Kind of performed in a way a pilgrimage of sorts with my family. And I think what my family and I were so blown away with was how beautiful it was. The interior of British Columbia is gorgeous. It's surrounded by mountains. And I didn't ever remember hearing my grandmother talk about how beautiful it was. And why would she? the landscape of the Japanese-Canadian internment, it wasn't about barbed wire fences. It was about the mountains being those fences. And there was one road in and one road out. And an RCMP officer would be at either end of that road. And so for me, it was a struggle to reconcile the breathtaking nature of British Columbia's landscape with the historical realities of my grandparents and thousands of others. How could I create work that could speak to both of these truths? And so I came home from this trip and started to wrestle. And what I began was a series called Locating Memory. And this is a series of 9 different pieces. And I was really interested with these ideas of how do we connect memory with place? How do we make that visible? How could I acknowledge the beauty of the land, but also the history that landscape has witnessed? And so working with all of these photographs that I'd taken, I printed them all out onto Japanese paper, and it kind of instantly transformed the materiality of these images. And then I cut everything up and kind of reconstructed this landscape. Running throughout this series, there's a horizon line connecting each piece. This first piece you can see is in full color, and then as you go through this series, the color starts to leach out. And I was interested in these ideas of how when we revisit memories, kind of details start to erode and we start losing track of all of those details. So by the end slide, you'll see it's just white on white. As the prints go, there starts to kind of more paper cutting becomes involved. So in this part of this mountain is cut away. And in the next slide, you'll see a number of clouds are cut away. And I was interested in all of these gaps in the stories as well, kind of what hasn't been shared. This horizon line that's connecting each piece to the next kind of both connects the images but also divides. This landscape is the landscape that has witnessed so much, but the sky is the sky that I experienced kind of so many years after the fact. And how do we reconcile those? So here's an image of my working process. It's a lot of time meticulously spent cutting. Fans are not really welcome in my studio for fear of things blowing away. Here's the next piece in this image. Traces of memory can be found and links to forgotten places are established, while voids and absences investigate the fragments and silences of what has been left unsaid or forgotten. And as you can see, the color really starts to disappear. The grid of the sky starts to invert. And so in here, in these last 3 slides, in these black and white images, I was really interested in process and how the process can be kind of really embedded into the ideas that I was exploring. And so up until this image, everything has been digitally printed from a computer. And what I was interested in is that when you print onto Japanese paper, you don't print white. That's always just the color of the paper. And so kind of this idea of as things get lighter and lighter, it's these memories get kind of forgotten and fade away. However, in printmaking, we can actually print white ink onto a piece of paper. And so what I did was, in this image here, it's starting to get harder to see, I took an image from my grandfather's photograph album, and this is a sky of this is a 1940s sky. And so I printed that, I made a photo etching, and I printed it in white ink onto Japanese paper. And if I were to hold this paper up to the light, you would be able to see all of the nuances of this sky. However, the way that I've mounted this, you can't see all of those details. And I was interested in all of the stories that aren't shared for different reasons, and the secrets that are kept, and the stories that are really kept private. And so this final image here is just the sky of my grandfather's that's printed in white ink and has become entirely opaque, and you can't access it anymore. here's an image of the installation. So you're just missing one here. While I was kind of really exploring the landscape of it in its physical sense, I was also interested in the geography. And as I was doing all of this reading about the internment and kind of so much different research that's been ongoing in terms of kind of historical research, as well as different first-person narratives and novels and fiction and historical fiction. I was kind of trying to pull all of these different bits together. And so I started mapping out the interior of British Columbia. And so this image here is 10 different prints that I've created that look at different areas of the interior of BC. And so while I was mapping everything, I was, as I said, kind of simultaneously doing all of this research. And I wanted to find a way to make work that brought those two ideas together, this geography, with all of this research. That a lot of it was kind of difficult to find, especially the oral histories from different people. And in making this work, it's also kind of finding how many people don't know these stories to begin with. And so when you get up close to this map, this piece is of Revelstoke, BC. So this is where my grandfather was sent to work on the road. And kind of the darker line that runs horizontal through this image is part of the Trans-Canada Highway. And so kind of really zooming in up close, you'll see that it's all text. So working at a really small scale, this image is composed entirely of men's firsthand accounts of what it was like to work in those road camps. I discovered I could write really small, and I display this work using a magnifying glass and really encourage viewers to get up close and to take time. And some of the words are legible, much of it is not. There's two layers of printing happening. There's a road layer and a water layer. And so in certain elements, the road layer obscures the water and makes it even more legible. So kind of really interested in these ideas of layering history and of veils, and how do you kind of, how has history been hidden in plain sight? In this next image here, this is, in terms of the geography, this is Slocan Lake, and a number of different camps were located around this lake. There was Slocan City, New Denver, Roseberry, Greenwood, and Sandon. My grandmother was in Slocan City camp, which is located right at the base, at the southern end of Slocan Lake. So this piece was important for me. And kind of when I was doing all of this research, I reread a book called Obasan, written by Joy Kagawa. And I reread this novel, and I discovered that what I thought had been my grandmother's experience of the internment was actually the main character in the story's experience. And I was kind of so surprised at how we conflate these histories and these stories of what we kind of take on as our own family's experiences. And so part of the text in this piece is from Joy Kagawa's Obasan. The other text that's in this piece is from Kirsten McAllister, a researcher and scholar who's been looking at the memorial that's been built in New Denver, which is along Slocan Lake. And it looks at how the community living there now remembers and has memorialized the internment. And so kind of these two stories within this piece of the past and present. And so in this image, you can see kind of an up-close version of what that looks like. And so in addition to kind of this kind of understanding the geography of the internment, I keep coming back to the photograph albums of my grandparents, and kind of looking through them, and for kind of trying to navigate these stories. And both my grandparents are long gone, and I can't ask any more questions. And so kind of I'll just take you through these images. There's one image, it's titled Mom and Me, June 1941. So this is an image of my grandmother and her mother in Vancouver, kind of just before they went to the camps. And then in this next image, this is my grandfather's album, and this depicts his time in the camps, working with the road crew. And when I asked my aunt about these photo albums, she said that when they would look through these albums, my grandfather just said, "That's where I worked." No context was given. It wasn't until kind of years later that she started to learn that, learned the context of where he was working and why. And so working with these photographs, I really wanted to explore kind of how and why the memories associated with the internment have been stored and packed away. How do we sort, contain, and navigate the weight of individual memory? How does transgenerational memory get passed on? And is it possible for these memories and stories to be made tangible? And so what I did was I pulled on traditional Japanese packaging and this idea of a furoshiki, in which you can take a square of cloth and you can fold up anything. It can be really utilitarian, or it can be used as a gift. And I loved this idea of the furoshiki, of packaging up these memories. And so I created photo etchings and photogravure etchings from these original family photographs. And then I printed them onto damp paper, and I used a paper making technique where I worked with a paper making studio, and we made the paper ourselves, in which the pulp has been beaten for longer than usual. And so we made paper from it, and then I printed my etchings on the paper, and then it takes many hours and several days to do all of these things, but then I wrapped the paper around a bundle of sand, and I tied it all up. And then because the pulp has been beaten for longer than usual, the fibers are really short. And so then when everything dries, it shrinks and it becomes really hard and stiff. So what happens is this paper around the sand kind of tightens and shrinks. And then I'm able to cut a hole in the bottom once everything's dry, and I drain out the sand. So in essence, all of these bundles are entirely hollow. They look heavy, but you pick them up and they weigh nothing. And I was just really intrigued with how that fits with our ideas and our memories. In some of these prints, you can see certain details, but much of the photograph is obscured and you can't see it. The way the paper dries, you can't actually unfold or unwrap any of these. They're kind of sealed shut. So here's another one. This is an image of my grandmother and grandfather, just after they were married. So these virtually weightless objects, they take up physical space, but really they weigh nothing. And so here's an image of kind of one of the first iterations of how I displayed these. It's an ongoing and ever-growing installation. I display them on a series of shelves, envisioning the installation as part of a library of sorts, kind of a way to catalog these memories. On the shelves, you'll also note that there's several furoshiki that are blank, and I really wanted those to stand in for the memories that aren't shared for so many different reasons. This, as I said, is an ongoing project, and so I've made probably about up to 400 now, and in the future, as this installation grows, now I'm working with other people's images and creating furoshiki for their memories. This project really started out with my own family's experience, but has grown to now include kind of many more Japanese Canadians, and being more comprehensive of the Japanese Canadian experience. And so, connected to this idea of the furoshiki, I started a different series of work called Collected Stories. And in this, I was really interested in interviewing different members of the Japanese Canadian community and those connected to it, and I wanting to record their oral histories, and kind of feeling some pressure as everyone's getting older, to really get these memories down on paper. And so in this image, this is Harold Miwa here. And so I conducted a number of different interviews, and I transcribed the interview, and then I transcribed it kind of over and over again onto a copper plate, and I etched these stories. The text is written at a really small scale. It's difficult for the viewer to read. This comments on how challenging it is for the viewer to access these stories, but also how difficult it is often for the individual to share these stories. In keeping with the idea of furoshiki as kind of the ability to give gifts, when I create a print, each of these prints, I give one back to the storyteller, or to the storyteller's family. And so this image here is Lillian Michiko Blakey, another artist featured on Tadaimai. And she was born at the end of the war in Alberta, and her grandparents and parents, they'd wanted to stay together during the war, so they opted to be relocated to Alberta to go and work on the sugar beet farms. The image that I showed earlier of Harold Miwa, he was interned in Tajmi, and he went to camp when he was about 12. And so when I've been doing my different interviews, I've really been wanting to get kind of a different range of stories. So interviewing people from different generations, and kind of as some of them go through, there's less legible bits of stories and huge absences, as different generations really have lost a lot of those stories. And here's a detail of Lillian's print. And again, this is an ongoing series of work. I continue to interview more people and record their stories, and then transcribe them into these etchings. It's a long process to work on these prints. Each piece probably takes me kind of 4 to 6 months to work on. I discovered I can write really tiny, and so that seems to be something that I'm very drawn to. But I think for me, part of this work, it's kind of depending on the materials that I'm using, and the histories, kind of everything is important. The process, the material, and the stories. And the hope is that kind of it all comes together to create a space of memory and for memory, and to really open up a space for dialogue. And that's really what I want to do through my work.
I don't hear anything.
Hello. Wow. Well, thank you. So today we're actually going to do a slightly different format. We're actually going to be doing a discussion with Teresa and Emma at the same time. So with that, if you have any questions, ask either artist. We're going to do it together. So we'll see how this works. And you may notice that we only have 8 minutes left to go in our hour. So we are once again going to go over. And as long as we get done by 8 for the next thing we're doing for Tadaima, we should be fine. So, I mentioned in my intro that Teresa and I have gone back a long ways. It was 2004 in Rhode Island at a photo conference that we met. And I really don't remember much about, did we talk much about our camp photos? We really didn't. It was just more about actually finding another Asian person at the conference, which really most, There weren't a lot of us in Rhode Island, or in SPE for that matter. And then it wasn't until the next year that I think when at Minidoka is when I first, really discovered that we actually had some kind of commonality to that. So when you were doing your work, doing your photography, did you envision this to be a book, or is it just really a project, or what was your goals, I guess, for your work?
I had hoped to turn the project into a book, much more than an exhibit per se, or a traveling show, just because books are so much more permanent, and I just wanted to organize it in a book fashion.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting, Emma, that I was looking at your work, and especially the furoshiki. It's almost like it's an artist book. I mean, each one of those furoshiki become a page, and it's laid out in a very, very linear fashion, almost like a book might be laid out also.
Mm-hmm.
Not quite as permanent, and not quite as shareable in a sense, like with a published book, but it does have that quality. Do you see your work as having that kind of qualities to it?
I do. I think in terms of the tactility of a book and being able to turn a page, and kind of the way that we sit with photos, and especially kind of family photo albums. This way that I love, Teresa, that you were talking about taking photos of photos and kind of constantly going back and comparing things. So I think all those furoshiki I can hold them. When I show them, I ask people not to hold them. But they are kind of these objects that make people want to engage with them, really.
Mm-hmm. So Teresa, like you were talking and I mentioned in the intro about the fact that you had like traditional black and whites, and you have the black and white infrared. And you mentioned in your talk that you like the dreamlike quality of the black and white infrared. Were there any other reasons you had for using that medium other than the aesthetics of it?
Primarily the aesthetics, I would say. I tried every type of film: color slide, color negative, black and white, just regular, and then the 2 1/4, and it just seems so much stronger to see the landscape in the infrared.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it definitely does distill it down. It gets, you lose some of the grays or the in-between tones, and really distills it down to just minimal blacks and whites. It's funny because I never told you this, is when I first started my project, part of what I did, my first year of going around all the camps, I shot some in black, white, infrared, and some in just the regular traditional films. And I actually went the other way. I thought that the aesthetics are so powerful and it's so distinct that I saw it as it took away. So I ended up going the opposite direction and just leaving those for my scouting trip shots, and went for just the 2 1/4 standard black and whites. So when you're okay, Teresa, I'm sorry. When you're working on this how many times did you go back to Minidoka to photograph, or back to Minidoka to photograph first?
Well, I didn't even keep track. I mean, I lived in the area, and so I was able to go there quite frequently, and that's why, in part, I started the project, is the proximity. And I also attended a lot of Minidoka pilgrimages, but I didn't tend to photograph so much during the pilgrimage because there's just so many people. It's a very an intense experience for everyone, and so it was more to just learn more myself as I was trying to understand the history.
Yeah, that's one thing I've noticed in the evolution maybe of the Minidoka pilgrimage, is the intensity that happened those first few, where it's not the same anymore. It's it's weird because now it's almost like I personally sense more of a panic or tension because of how many of the Nisei are passing away, and we're losing this amazing resource. And in the beginning, they were older, but they weren't. It wasn't like we're thinking, oh gosh, it's imminent. We have to make sure we talk to them. And now we do. But back then, I think it was so raw I think that was part of the biggest deal. For many people, especially those first couple ones, that was the first time they went back to Minidoka.
I agree.
Right?
And Emma made that point about how people, you felt this sense of urgency because they are disappearing and passing away. So,
yeah. So, Emma, do they have pilgrimages for the Canadian camps at all?
There are some. I haven't been a part of any of the organized ones. It's hard kind of living in Ontario. BC's far away. And it's tricky because the majority of Japanese Canadians, I would say there's a huge population who live in Ontario and East because after the war ended, they weren't allowed to go back to the coast until 49. So really everyone had moved and settled. So to go back was to kind of uproot again. So it's interesting in talking to some of the different people, we said, do you think you would have had different conversations if you'd lived closer to these sites, if you could actually kind of more easily take your families to and do a pilgrimage? So not a lot of them have done pilgrimages. I know that, I guess my grandmother did go back with my aunt, not in an organized one, but just together they went.
Mm-hmm. Is there much left of the sites as far as, that, or is it just completely been reused?
In New Denver, there's a memorial. So there was a sanatorium there. So a lot of people got TB. And so people who were sick or the elderly, they were allowed to stay in New Denver. And so some of the original shacks are still there. And the hospital, or kind of what was used as a hospital then, remained. But pretty much there's nothing left from the other sites.
Okay. Yeah, that definitely makes it harder, I think, to go and get a sense of place for that. So on your pieces locating memory, so you led off with those. Was that the first series you did, or how did that fit into your timetable?
Yeah, that was the first series I did after after I did my own pilgrimage. The first series of work, kind of all of this really started because I found a box of my grandmother's old sewing patterns, and I kind of was rooting around and inside. So she took a drafting course in 41. And then inside these pattern books, there's all these notebook pages dated 1943. And there's a list of names and measurements. And so she was clearly making clothes for other people when she was in the camps. And so kind of finding that box of patterns really kind of opened up everything for me in terms of wanting to research kind of where she learned to sew and then who she was making clothes for and wanting to learn how to read her patterns and make her patterns. So that was the beginning. And that was in about 2008, I think.
Okay. Wow. So in your work, because it was a tough one to put this question answer discussion together, because for the two of you, because your work is so dissimilar. Teresa, yours is this very, very, single media centric, photography basing, whereas Emma, you have this wide gamut of a media, and also in the way that which you produce the finished work is quite different. When you are coming up or working on a project, what does the content of the work dictate or suggest the media and presentation, or do you get inspired by some kind of presentation, think, oh, I can fit this with a different kind of content?
I think it's a bit of both. Definitely kind of, I like to work on a number of different projects at the same time. It keeps, a lot of my work is all about repetitive actions. So if I can change that up, it's helpful. But I think they've naturally led into the next. So while I'm, kind of researching the map, I started talking to people who were interned in different camps. And then I wanted to record not just their experience in that camp, but their kind of larger experience. So then I was recording full oral histories and then collecting photographs. So kind of each project seemed to flow into the next, and the different projects required different means of representation, and some needed photos and some needed text, I guess.
Okay. I'm going to go to a question. We're going to actually skip down quite a ways on questions, because there's one from Clement Hanami. He goes, actually, I shouldn't do Clement's. I will start off with Fuji Designs. I didn't realize that they were so small. When you first started this project, did you do test prints and wrappings to get an idea where the main image would show up? And this would be the Fudoshiki pieces, I imagine.
When I first did the project, I actually I took a workshop out at Anderson Ranch in Colorado, and I created the photo plates of these photo etchings. And so I was really limited to the size of the etching. And then I was creating different furoshiki from that, just on kind of regular Japanese paper and wrapping them up. And then once I started to understand the technique, and then I really worked with a papermaking studio, and we figured out kind of the process that I use now. And then once I figured that out, then I could go back and start making additional photo etching plates that kind of worked within the size of really kind of different decal molds that the papermaking studio I worked at has. Mm-hmm. So kind of lots of different technical factors to play in.
Yeah, I find it interesting that use the furoshiki, since it's a just a beautiful blank cloth used to hold a gift to give to somebody, but then the idea is that it's given back with a return gift. Mm-hmm. And I think that for a lot of what we get to do with the pilgrimages, with the Nikkei, is now there's this for intergenerational gifts back and forth. Mm-hmm. that are the Nikkei, our grandparents, in some case great grandparents, are giving us an idea of what they've been through, but also to understand a little bit more of family history. And then we, as the offspring of those people, get to give them this chance to actually maybe finally come to grips, or at least verbalize what they've gone through. And it kind of goes to the idea that, and Clement has, this is the question I was going to get to, was I'm wondering about Teresa's work. Are there journals where all those stories or histories are documented for others to read?
I have saved all of my notes. I recorded some of the interviews and transcribed them myself. Some of them I did not record, but I typed up my notes. And I've never put them online. I didn't follow the traditional oral history guidelines, and so it's more from a journalistic point of view, these interviews. But I guess I feel like I didn't ask the people that I interviewed if I could make them public, and so I'm a little reticent to do that. And many of them have passed away. I guess they wouldn't mind now, but I guess because I didn't bring it up at the time, that I'm hesitant to do that.
Have you thought maybe asking their descendants? Because it's one of the things where it's interesting with Emma's is her interviews, in a sense, are on her pieces. So it's obviously, they hopefully, if they were around, they agree. But it's, it is, difficult to not, get that permission. Then, after the fact, say, okay, well, I think they would have agreed because they gave it to me to begin with. But, but it is a tough question, I think, or a tough decision to make. Do you, what do you divulge? What do you not divulge?
It is. Yes, because you're having a one-on-one conversation versus something that they know might be public. And I think maybe people wouldn't maybe talk as freely, thinking that. At least that's my thought anyway. Yeah.
Well, and especially back then, it was, as time has gone, passed from the time you did that, it's become a little bit easier to get these conversations and to get these stories. So when you're working on your working on this project and interviewing these people, so you never really thought you'd include the interviews as part of the, other than like they include like some stories in in the book, but was that never part? It was more to gather information then?
The condensed stories that I included in the book, it was to distill different aspects of people's lives. And I tried to seek out, not as many people as I could photograph, but specific, if you could use the word, types of people, like someone who was repatriated, someone who was a draft resistor, people from Oregon, Washington, Alaska. I had someone, sisters from California, and then the people who stayed in Idaho. So I just wanted to have a sampling of all the different people that were there and try and tell a story through those examples.
So Emma, were your sources written sources, or were some of them oral sources also?
All of them, with the exception of one, have been oral, kind of me meeting people and interviewing them. So the Japanese Canadian Cultural Center in Toronto has been really wonderful for me in terms of meeting people and making connections that way. I had one really wonderful moment where I was there interviewing two older men, and there was a lunch happening at the center, and I sat down, and across from me this little old Japanese man sat down and started chatting with me, and I asked him where he had been, kind of where he was interned, and he said, Yard Creek Road Camp, and I said, well, that's where my grandfather was. And he said, well, who's your grandfather? And we played the name game. And he said, well, I was best man at his wedding.
Oh, wow.
That's great.
Oh.
And then we just had this amazing conversation, and we met up a couple of weeks later, and I brought in all these photo albums, and we sat for about 3 hours, and I just recorded our conversation as we looked through these photo albums. And I got all these stories that I'd never heard before.
Wow.
And it was, just very special.
Yeah. I mean, that is just so amazing that, you didn't have a chance to talk to your grandfather, but got to get those stories.
Yeah.
Oh, that's so amazing.
Yeah.
Ken Mochizuki has a question, and it would actually definitely apply for both of you. It's the most existential question I think we've had all series. What is it? Is the definition of an artist one of your artistic? Of an artist, I'll say one of your artistic work becomes your existence, your reason for existing being. You guys get to figure out what that means.
It's like a Zen koan.
Yeah. So basically, I saw it and didn't really read the words, but so basically, the definition of an artist. So your art becomes your existence. Is that the case for you? Is there a transformation in you when you produce a work? And is there an identity? Have you had an identity change since you started your projects? That can go to either one of you or both.
You can go first.
Okay. For me, it's been over a decade now that I've been creating this work and doing this research, and definitely things have changed in terms of my understanding of history and my understanding of my family's history, but also in the way that we can think about history and access history. And I think for me, when I'm making the work, a lot of the kind of working with the photographs and working with these oral histories, because everything is so repetitive, there's a way that I'm kind of with these people while I'm working on their piece. So I think that part is quite interesting. And I record the oral history, and then I transcribe it onto my computer, and then I have to transcribe that transcription onto a copper plate. And I will sit at my plate for hours and hours and weeks. And there's a way that you kind of sit with these stories in a very different way. So I think that's had a real impact. And then I look at these pieces and I I don't see just the artwork. I see the person and I see the story. So there's a real relationship with them.
Okay, how about you, Teresa?
Question again. It's a tough one to answer. I feel like I'm not an artist. I'm a documentary photographer, and I have always loved pictures, and that's why you saw a lot of the historic ones mingling with mine, because I just see the link of photography through the years and how they hold all these memories together. And so for me, it's kind of putting the images together, combining them, and telling a new story or understanding a story more deeply. And so that's, I guess, not really directly answering it, but I just don't think of myself as an artist. Like, I see Emma's work and she's an artist. I'm a photographer, and not that photographers aren't artists, but I just don't self-identify that way.
So it's more documentary, really,
Mm-hmm.
in a sense. You're documenting. So in a sense, you're almost like a visual historian, is how you see it then?
I think so.
So Emma, you mentioned about doing that, you talk about the history of things. Has history always been something that's been part of you, or a major contributor to your artwork, or is it just specifically for this, for the work that we've seen here?
I'm trying to think now. Maybe not history, but narrative and story and experience.
Mm-hmm.
And I think for me, the work always has to be connected to further layers and deeper layers.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm always interested in kind of what lies beneath. So this has become kind of a much bigger and richer history than I was working with earlier on. But I think my early work would, kind of taps into those stories.
Okay. On the narrative angle, I have these notes here I was taking when you were talking about your stuff on the road camp pieces. And you said that you layered like the road with the text, and then had the water layer.
Mm-hmm.
As far as the words that compose the water layer, what were they? Sorry, how did you determine what was water and what was road? Was there any difference to those points?
Not really. Generally, I would kind of find texts that were relevant to those geographies.
Mm-hmm.
And then I would say how I made the distinction were the text that I wanted to be a little bit more legible would go on the road plate. And then kind of other text would go on the water plate.
Mm-hmm.
Because often that would be layered underneath the roads or overwritten so that you couldn't really see it.
Okay.
Or there would be some text that maybe if people didn't want really public, then there's a way to have it in there, but it's veiled and people can't really access it.
Was that something you came across a lot, where someone said, "Oh, I'll tell you my story, but I don't want really people to know about it"?
No, I don't think so. I often wonder what my grandmother would think about all of this. And wonder, how she would feel about me sharing her story in the way that I have, and my grandfather. So I think I'm just always conscious of that. And I think the silences that have existed for so long, I'm always just very, very conscious of that.
Mm-hmm. So taking off that a little further, Teresa, when you talked to people and interviewed them, how much resistance did you come across at the time to people, not wanting to tell the story, or people saying, "Oh, I don't remember much," or things like that? How did it? How pervasive was it in your research?
There was only one gentleman who did not want to talk about it, and in the book, his arms are folded, and his body language is he clearly didn't want to talk, and he was the only one. Everyone else was very open to sharing their history, which was such a gift. I kind of get choked up thinking about all the people that are gone.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I only had one.
Yeah, that photograph of Emily and May, just that one's a tough one.
Yeah, Emily was working on her film, about May and at the time. And so we're both out at the site, before all the other people were.
Yeah. So Emma, how about you? Did you come across any people that were very reluctant and maybe ultimately never did tell a story?
It's hard to say. I think there's some leads that I've tried and we just haven't connected, and it's hard to know if those are because people don't quite know. I don't know. I don't know if they're hesitant or if life gets in the way. So I think, I could read some of those both ways. I think for me, I've been different people who've been connecting me with people. They're asking people who are willing to share stories. So kind of already I have the go ahead because people know who to ask.
So for both of you, even though Brian asked it of Teresa, do you have any new projects you're currently working on?
I'll let.
Do you want to go first?
So Teresa, you go first since Ron wrote it to you.
All right. I was just talking to Yosh Nakagawa, and he suggested that I talk to Anna Tamura about working on a garden book. So I currently am not. I feel like I spend time doing some presentations about Minidoka, and I try to give it a lot of thought and energy about focusing the talk to the audience. And so I've been doing some of that and not working on any new photographic projects at this time.
Okay. And how about you, Emma?
I would say, so kind of the last two bodies of work that I was showing, the furoshiki, the sculptural ones, and as well as the text etchings. Those two series are really ongoing for me. They're so time consuming that I have interviews that are ready to go and I just haven't done them yet. And lots of photographs to work with. So kind of the vision and the goal is to really have a much more comprehensive archive, I would say, of these photographs.
So on the photograph of the furoshiki on the shelves on the wall, you talked about the blank ones and the stories that aren't told, but you also had gaps on the shelf. Were they symbolic of it? Are the gaps symbolic, or they just haven't been filled yet?
No, I think both. I think kind of open to viewers' interpretation, right? I like that idea that it's a placeholder for something else to come or that has been. I think there's a way that, kind of the empty ones and the blank ones can be stand-ins for those stories that aren't shared. But, the gaps could be the ones that we don't even know we're missing. I think there's, kind of a lot of room for people to sit with it however they want to. Or to think that they're gone already or, a lot of wiggle room.
Okay. So we have a question from Gordon Sakawe. Is there a rough percentage of JC who return to BC as opposed to staying in eastern areas? For travelers, what are the best resources for visiting Slocan?
Great questions, and I don't have the answers. I actually have no idea how many would have returned to BC. I don't know those numbers at all. Some people, it's interesting. If you were on the other side of the 100-mile radius in BC, you were able to stay. So there were some interesting stories of people who, didn't have to go to camps, who were allowed to stay. But I don't know what those numbers look like. For travelers, what are the best resources for visiting Slocan? Slocan City, there isn't anything there to see. We drove around and there really wasn't much to see, but an old mining town or an old logging town, I guess. But New Denver has a wonderful garden and kind of historical memorial center to go and see. So New Denver is the place to go. Okay. And then they'll link you up with maps of where else to go and what are the other routes to travel.
Okay. Since fishing was such a major part of the Japanese-Canadian livelihood before the war, and since they didn't return west, do you know what became the predominant, or what did they do after the war for work?
So my grandparents, on my grandmother's side, they had a fishing boat, but then the boat was sold, used to pay for their internment. So they came east. They also had a rooming house in Vancouver. So I'm trying to remember what my great grandparents did. Now I can't remember, but my grandparents, they kind of started their lives here. So my grandfather ran an Esso gas station, and my grandmother made clothes for other people, and kind of lots of different stories of people who kind of got different education and kind of tried to find their feet in Ontario, really, and other provinces. But I think the challenge was with the Canadian internment, everything was sold, so there was nothing to go back to.
Okay. So Teresa, this is actually a question I've been forgetting to ask you pretty much since I saw you at Minidoka for the first time. Since you didn't have a connection, you didn't have a family connection to the camps, what was your driving reason for doing this project? Other than, was it just curiosity, or was there some other kind of connection you saw? Because for Emma having relatives in the camp, or me having relatives in the camp, a lot of times it's explaining our family histories. But since you didn't have that, what was your reason for doing it?
I just thought it was so ironic, if that's the right word choice, that here was this camp just a few hours from where my parents lived, and it being in Idaho. And I did have a lot of connections to the history, but just not Minidoka specifically. So it was just wanting to understand what happened and to get to hear some of the story. You hear the number, but you don't hear all the individual stories, and there's too many to hear all of them. But I mean, it was wonderful to just be able to hear some of them.
Mm-hmm. So what do you think of the changes to the site over the years?
I'm glad
as a photographer.
Yes, I'm glad I photographed it when I did. Now near the chimney, there's a bench, for people to sit down. There's more signage. It's good because there's information available, but it looks, very different from when I first visited.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a question I get asked a lot, and I'm a little disappointed. Maybe this is that romance of discovery, when it's just really really run down. There's not really a lot of evidence of people around, in a sense, even though obviously with Minidoka you had all the farms in the area.
Mm-hmm.
But still, just being able to look around and find the base of the water tower, or find little things here and there, go, oh my gosh, this is part of that camp, and not have just it built for you as it is now. But it is nice to see that. That's one thing unfortunate about the Canadian camps, not having the sites and not having the artifacts or the physical presence there. It has to be more of imagination rather than a physical reminder. So we are way over. We probably should wrap this up. So so I really want to thank you too. It was it's funny because when I started talking about this, I said it's really hard because your work is so different. But I think this narrative, that storytelling aspect, was a strong thing. Now, obviously, all our artists we've had have a narrative in their work, but I think it's just two interesting directions you take the narrative. Emma, you include the narrative in your work. The physical evidence of that narrative is there. With Teresa, some of that physical evidence in the book, but in your photographs themselves, it seems like the narrative really informs your photographs, so that it's one that a lot of people can look at the photograph and apply their own narratives too. And so, so fortunately, we did have a commonality in the work. So once again, thank you very much for agreeing to do this with us. It's been amazing. Oh, so Teresa, is your book still for sale?
It is still available, and they're almost gone. And I think the publisher is going to do a small second run. So I'm very happy.
Oh.
I think I just bleeped out. I'm happy that it will be still available for a little while longer.
So where can they find it?
Amazon.com has it online. The Park Service site at Minidoka, and also the Craters of the Moon, I know, carry it, and some other small bookstores. People will email me and say, "Oh, I saw your book at some little town bookstore." So it's kind of just scattered here and there.
Okay. And Emma, do you have any shows up right now currently?
No, currently nothing right now.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, it was a busy year last year, but right now things are kind of a little bit quiet with the pandemic.
Okay. Well, I am so thankful that it was busy last year, because that's actually how I found you. Is you were actually, once I found the way to search you, you were all over the internet. So it was very easy to, not easy to track you down, but easy to see that. Oh, okay, I've seen you, in several places. So that was good. So anyhow, what I want to do is remind you all, first off, tomorrow I have at 2 p.m. we're going to have a special screening of Sharon Yamato's and Stan Honda's Moving Walls. That'll be at 2 o'clock Pacific time, and there'll be a question, answer, and discussion that follows that. And then for our final Fine Art Friday Artist Talk, we have Emily Hanako Momahara, who is, of all the artists that we've had, the person I've known the longest, even longer than Teresa. And so I encourage you to watch and participate in our discussion. Okay. So once again, thank you very much. That's it until next week.
Thank you, John.